Everybody, I'm still going to give it a couple more minutes. There's still people adding in. Give it till 2 or 3 after the hour.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good morning, Monica. We're going to get started here in just a minute.
Okay. Good morning, Parrish.
I can't disconnect because I will close out the whole meeting. Do you want it recorded?
I started the recording on it.
Okay.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Megan is technically the organizer of the meeting, but she handed over the host capacities to me. I am recording this, so we'll send that over to Gio and Chris afterwards, and they can get it posted back on our website and the Visit Alpine Texas website too. So anybody who wasn't able to attend today or just wanted to rehear some of the parts from it, will be able to go back and review. The just kind of the order for today. I mean, I'll give a couple opening thoughts, but really wanted to have more Q&A than anything today. I have it configured right now so that you can all, unmute yourself if you have something to say. If we get to kind of, I think now we're up to 15, 18 people. If it gets a little too big, I can convert over to mute all, and then you raise your hand or show me the thumbs up sign, and then I'll unmute you to talk. I'm certainly hoping, we'll just do whatever works here for the group. The whole idea and notion around today's call was, Chris and I were talking last week. I know many of you drive questions directly to him, and Chris is just a wonderful resource. I appreciate all of his work and tenacity in supporting Alpine, as well as the entire Big Bend region and Brewster County. So, continue to feel that you can always reach out to Chris. But we also thought it would be important to maybe have some live questions. I know he sent out, a sheet he's been sending out communication sheets trying to address some of the questions that are out there. But thought maybe today would be a good forum. Hopefully some of you were able to listen to the radio show yesterday afternoon. The judge and I were interviewed by Martin Benovich at 3. And, a lot of the talk yesterday was just about, the next 4 to 6 weeks for Alpine and Brewster County in this entire region. As many of you know, the judge, myself, the mayor, sheriff, police chief, Dr. Escobar from the hospital, Rick Flores from the hospital, Becky Watley, and Leo Dominguez from the university are getting together a couple times a week, really talking about some of the progressive steps that are happening and what's the right decision to make. And certainly this is not something that, dealing with the pandemic that we have, call it recent experience. And so just really trying to be very thoughtful and mindful about what's happening and striking that balance, certainly with a heavy emphasis on the health of our citizens and the health of the community, but also certainly being very understanding to the fact that this is impacting businesses. Alpine, really, if you think about it, is predicated on with the university here. The university drives a lot in the community, and then tourism. So along with tourism, you have to have good hotels, you have to have good motels, and of course we have a growing short-term rental business. In fact, when I left in 2017, I think we had 14. When I came back, we had north of 60 short-term rentals, and now we're north of 75. So we know that it's definitely a calling because of the tourism out here. So a lot of what happens at our biweekly meetings is just a discussion about understanding what's happening at the federal level. I think most folks are either watching what the president and the White House are delivering on an evening basis or reading that online afterwards, as well as tracking what the governor is doing in the state of Texas. So, and then certainly we're all looking at adjoining states, as well as some of the epicenters, the New Yorks, the Californias, the Floridas, the New Jerseys, and trying to understand what's happening there too. I think because of that, that's really where we saw the governor drive the executive order from his office on this weekend, limiting, not necessarily limiting travel from some of those hot cities, but requiring quarantine from those states, excuse me. And then he expanded that to specific cities on Sunday as well. And from an application perspective, what that means here in Alpine for us is as we see different flight plans coming in with, point of origin or point of where that plane is based out of, we're certainly implementing those pieces. And, the other piece that the judge in the group talked about yesterday is, do we move to a shelter in place, and what does that look like? I know on the radio he said, if we have a confirmed case, we're immediately moving into that. He does have that order drafted. My sense is, from talking to the judge, that he is concerned that, do we push this from a reactive perspective, or do we just say, hey, let's move forward with shelter in place, and what does that look like? So that's the piece right now that I think is weighing on his mind as I talk to him. Part of my thoughts have been, and what I tried to share on the radio yesterday, is I think we have people in the community that are very passionate about where we live and very passionate about the health and safety of others. And so generally speaking, if we compare how we're doing with social distancing and adhering to that, generally speaking, we have a greater reflection of people doing the right thing in Alpine than many other parts of the country. And so I think that's a good thing. And we want to continue to encourage that so that we can minimize and mitigate the potential of any sort of widespread COVID virus spread down here. And one of the things I do reflect on, Dee and the kids and I lived in Eagle, Colorado for 3 years from 2008 till 2011. And if you're studying the stats up there, Eagle, Colorado is it's a Vail Valley, so it's a heavy tourist area, a lot of second and third homes. Probably per capita, they are absolutely one of the worst hit in the US right now. They've got well north of 100 cases and a population base in that county of about 30,000. So we think about what our hospital can serve here. We're serving 3 counties or 23,000 people. We certainly wouldn't want, 100 active cases, 20, 25 needing significant medical care. So, those are really the precautionary things that we're contemplating. So I think the other $1 million question is, what's going to happen with the order as far as limiting hotel, motel, short-term rentals. My sense is the judge is going to push that order to the April 9th. Currently, the city is at April 6th, and the county is at April 2nd. But my sense is he's going to push that at least 7 days, if not 14 days. One of the things that I wanted to kind of share with folks is if I share my screen and we look at a couple of the slides that we talk about in our meetings. The first one is kind of where, from a Texas perspective, where we're at with case counts. And fortunately, if we look, at the 6 or 7 counties right around us, we don't have cases. I think the one in Reeves County was reclassified to an alternate location. The other piece that we look at heavily is what are the peak resources and where do we anticipate? And this is just all basic statistic modeling. So if you're a math major, these are types of things that historically you've probably engaged in, and it's just looking at resources, beds, ventilators, who's going to go into ICU, just based on projections. So when we look at this particular graph, this is showing the United States of America, but you can drop down and look at any particular state. So we'll just look at Texas right now. Peak resources in Texas are projected to be needed on May 5th, right? So we're still sitting about 35 days out from that particular date. And of course, this is looking at the whole state. We don't have anything that really looks specific county by county, but that is a data point that we talk about with the hospitals. And then, certainly we look at this, which is kind of a case map. And I'll be glad to send these links out to Chris afterwards, and he can share those. Some of you probably are already looking at these. So those are the things that we're looking at. I think from a city perspective, when the county pushes out the hotel, motel, short-term rental emergency ordinance to restrict stay to law enforcement, military, and critical infrastructure, the city certainly falls under that jurisdiction, and will continue to, basically run in parallel with the county on that. So, with that's probably a good time for me to stop with comments and open up for questions. one of the other things that we shared in the blog yesterday, Chris and Marcy and Megan had done quite a bit of work on looking at the CARES Act and the implications for our businesses and our residents here. And so how do we get the most information out there and provide resource so that people can go utilize those tools as part of the stimulus package. So yesterday's blog, we listed out the specific link on the I think they call it disaster recovery piece of that. Those are SBA type loans. And then there are specific provisions within the loans that allow for some of it not to be repaid if it's COVID impacting.
And Eric, if I may, the biggest question in my mind about these SBA loans, there's several different kinds that are mentioned in the federal law. The one that is the most promising, as far as I can see, is the one called the Payroll Protection Program, which is 8 weeks of payroll, utilities, mortgage, or rent that would be completely forgiven and not needed to be paid back. But what's not clear to me, and this is why I've been suggesting that folks talk to SBDC first before they apply, is how do you ensure that the pot of money you're asking from SBA is that one and not something else where they're guaranteed loans. So if you default or something, that it gets paid, but who wants that? You know, we want to find the ones that are essentially grants. That's not quite clear to me yet, is how do we ensure that that our businesses are applying for that completely forgivable grant program? And I'm still working on that.
Good. And you know, as I look through the list of attendees, I mean, certainly I think most folks know my parents run short-term rental business as well. And I've committed to work through the process with them on that too, because I'm curious, Chris, how do you provide the protection? Because you know, some folks may not need to borrow any money, and you don't want to get into a case where you have to pay any sort of fees or interest on something that's not going to be forgiven. And so there is that level of certainty when I think about it from an economics perspective. So we definitely have to dig into that. Thank you for pushing on that, and I'll be working through the process as well. And you know, if we need to get back together, either the end of this week, or we need to blog about it, or we need to have another meeting next week once we have more definitive information on that. Let's do that. Okay, Chris?
You bet. And for everyone else, if I may, you, as Eric said, you can unmute yourself. So perhaps if you're ready to ask a question or make a comment, maybe unmute yourself and say your name so Eric can kind of recognize each person, and that way nobody's talking over each other.
Hi, Eric. This is Clay. Can you hear me?
I can.
I do think I'm a little concerned that, you know, since the city, and again, I don't know fully if it's all of Brewster or just the city, has taken a very different stance than the rest of Texas in terms of, you know, as we had discussed, the essential business and essential travel. I'm a little concerned if you guys are in the mindset of, well, if there's anything that needs to be done, it's done at the federal level, because these are specific decisions that the city at least is taking that is much more stringent than the rest of Texas, that really affects our businesses. And I think beyond just right now, and obviously we're all concerned and trying to do the right thing, but beyond right now is if this resurfaces, you know, later in the year, I don't think that any of the businesses, hotels that are affected can survive. I mean, you know, these are our biggest months of the year. Obviously, we already all had almost all reservations canceled. It's not like there's any flood, but the fear is that if this does resurface in the fall and basically the city just, you know, shuts us back down, we're not really able to, nobody can really run a business and stay in business. And I think I'm just a little concerned if we're too focused on, you know, the federal government will take care of it, even though, you know, again, the city took much more stringent actions than other places in Texas. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple different layers on that question. I mean, relative to the federal government, when we talk about the federal government, most of that right now is related to the stimulus dollars that Congress passed. Um, certainly the president has given guidance in extending, um, his guidance basically. But when you think about it from a state perspective, then it kind of comes down to the states and what each state is particularly doing. When Governor Abbott signs off on an order from a state level, we have to follow it. I mean, there's not leeway per se on that. It's just from a state of Texas perspective. So those travel things that I talked about earlier were relative to the governor's order. And then from a county or local governance perspective, because we are home rule, we're not able to certainly circumvent anything that the governor says, but we're able to create more stringent type of adherence to it. And so the thought process, Clay, on the restriction with the hotels, motels, and short-term rentals. Now, let me take a step back. The day before that was put in place, Commissioners Court had a meeting, and there were folks that stood up and talked about when the governor's order had gone into place earlier in the week, shutting down restaurants for dine-in and then really restricting the amount of people that could gather. There had been significant fall off in reservations to the tune of some folks saying, we've lost 90% of our reservations. So we knew the trend was a huge drop off based on what the state had done. And then we looked at, I think the biggest concern was, do you then have folks that are trying to quarantine or find solace out in, Brewster County? You've got a national park, you've got a state park. And then as they transfer through the different communities to go to those areas, are we finding people or are we attracting people that are more quarantined in base? And so then that poses a greater risk, right? And so the decisions in being, more strict, so to speak, than other parts of the country were predicated on having less medical personnel and less hospital, per geographic square mile. And so that's where those decisions came from. And they certainly weren't taken lightly. The thought process on that, Clay, was, what happens if you get overwhelmed from a hospital perspective? And does that then really put your environment in greater risk? And so, when you make decisions, you shut things down. I mean, obviously you've taken a different path, so you'll never really know. I mean, but we can look at other communities, like I mentioned earlier. Eagle, Colorado is one. Now they're on a interstate, so and certainly they're a tourist type community, but they have had a huge rise in COVID type cases, and that has impacts on their hospital. So those were just some of the things that were contemplated on. Certainly one hotelier decided to sue the county, J.P. Bryan, and on the initial injunction, the district judge ruled against, or basically ruled in favor of the county providing that emergency declaration. So I think the judge is very aware that case as it goes through will be looked at not only from a state level, but probably from other communities across the nation to see the longer term impacts on that. And the idea is not to have businesses fail. I mean, none of us want to be experiencing any of this, but the reality of it is, when you're looking at it and you're talking to your doctors in your hospital and you're asking where they're at as far as preparedness, then you make decisions based on that risk factor.
And I definitely appreciate that. I just think that, I'm hoping that some consideration is being given to, what the city specifically can do. We really do have a symbiotic relationship in terms of our business, and I would imagine the taxes that we pay. I know, again, I'm maybe an outlier, but I think my property taxes went up 150%. If we are impacted this much and we are symbiotic, it does seem like there's going to have to be relief. And I just hope that, again, my point is I'm hoping that the city doesn't push all this off onto like, well, the federal program, I have all these programs for you guys. Cause I mean, I'm really hoping that the city does take into account what the city can do if, we are forced to shut down as we have been. We're not restaurants. This is a hotel call. We can't do takeout or whatever. I mean, I'm 100% hard down and it is what it is, but the taxes and a lot of other things, and not just delaying taxes, delaying payments doesn't do anything. I mean, this, revenue is lost. And so again, just trying to put it out there, we're symbiotic. And if you guys do want us to survive and to continue to invest and improve what we have, the city is going to have to do something, because there's no way anybody can, survive with this, even with a little injection from the Fed. So,
Well, one of the things let me talk a little bit about property tax as well, because I think this is a good point for everybody on this call to understand. And I would encourage people to attend school board meetings as well. I went to one last month, and because of where our property taxes are compared to where the state expects us to be, we were at 89%. Anything below 95%, the state starts reducing the amount of support that they give to the individual school district. So right now, Alpine Independent School District is about $300,000 to $400,000 behind what they had projected the state was going to give them. You have X amount of years to make it up. They've been given 2 or 3 years to make it up, and they haven't. And so that's going to be a point of contention. I would suggest to everybody on this call who's experienced increases in property taxes, or if you look across the property tax base, that you get involved with where the school district is at, because they're a huge driver on this, as well as talk to our state representatives and our state senators, because as long as we're viewed as taxing below what the state feels, or valuing below what the state feels we should, there's going to be pressure on this. And
I don't think that's the question, Eric. I think the question is, the school district didn't shut us down. The city shut us down, and the county shut us down. So in respect to the amount of taxes that we are paying to those two entities, what sort of relief are the city and the county giving to all property owners, but particularly us, because we're also paying you hotel and motel tax. So while we can place the blame on the ISD, and I totally agree that our school district taxes are way out of whack, the question I believe that Clay was asking was the entities that shut us down, although the governor said that lodging is an essential service. Mm-hmm. What are you guys doing to mitigate the loss that you are creating on the hotel industry here?
Well, so when we look, Monica, specifically at the challenges that businesses are facing in the community, we are going to look at our property tax and sales tax allocations across the general fund, where we see the changes occurring. In fact, Megan and I were talking this morning. We're looking at that. We're certainly looking at our utilities as well. And, we've sent letters out to people on, if they're behind on the utility and it's COVID-19, to get with us, and we'll work with them on that particular payment schedule. And then we're also working back with, Chris and I are working on the hotel occupancy tax and how we spend that, and do we have an opportunity to, I don't know whether it's necessarily refund, but if we create some type of incentives, once a tax is assessed, it has to be obviously paid. That's a government requirement. But then can you provide some sort of incentives back to folks based on that. So those are all the pieces that we're pulling together right now.
Eric, could I ask one thing as well? On the utilities piece, do you think it would be possible to propose to council that hotels specifically, which have been closed by council, could the city look at the utilities that are assessed by the city and actually not just give a delay in payment, but actually waive those bills in consideration for the lost revenue that's incurred by this order? Is that
Well, so what do you mean by that? If they're,
well, maybe
they're
for
not being used, if they're not
No.
being used?
well, like if just I don't know if it's realistic, but it occurs to me that at least for the period of the order, when there's no revenue coming in that's enforced, even though we know utilities are being used, but can the city just absorb the cost for those businesses since they're bearing a cost?
Well, so if a business is closed and they're not using the utilities, we would expect that.
Well, the bill would be lower, but they'll still have electricity.
But then, well, the city, remember, Chris, the city has water and gas. The city doesn't control
Oh,
the
right.
electric.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
So you have water and gas. If there are facilities that are closed, could you look at some of the fixed costs, like your base rate and your sanitation? If those aren't being used, yeah, the city absolutely can look at that. We would expect consumption would be, at or near zero if they're actually closed.
Well, consumption's not going to be at or near zero because we still have to keep the building, there's still use. Even if you've got a light turned on, it's still using kilowatt hours. If you've got a light turned out, it's still
Monica, when you stepped away, the electric utility is not controlled by the city.
That's a good point. But okay, so let me ask you this. Can you waive the portion of property taxes for the period that you've got to shut down?
The council can always look at,
Can you advocate for that?
next year. Well, so property taxes would have been paid, were due by January 31st. So council, as they move through the budget this year, will look at assessments on the property tax for the payment that will come due January of next year.
Right, but that doesn't help us. This is Sharon Kellner, Alpine Bed and Breakfast. That doesn't help us now. That really doesn't help us now. None of the things that you're talking about is going to help us get through what we're going through now. Without the hotels, there's no tourism. And without the people who need that income, a lot of these places can't open up again. So what it's creating is a downward spiral that the infrastructure is just gonna collapse. We can't continue this way without being able to make reservations, without being able to say, okay, on such and such a date. All this stuff for the future and a tax delay and this and that, that's not helping. We'll already be gone. A lot of places will.
Yeah, and so, in the short term, part of the immediate cash is, if you go out and look at the SBA loans and what's applicable to be forgiven via the COVID, that's the piece that we talked about earlier. The one that I shared on the link yesterday can offer up to $10,000 in immediate cash. And so that will help some of the businesses keep afloat from a small business perspective. And that's applicable to, the cost and the lost revenue associated with the COVID-19 virus. And so that's the quickest, shortest path to helping provide some financial assistance to people.
Our lender's telling us that's a 90-day process at minimum.
So the lenders are they not engaged? I mean, I have to go in and start working through that process.
Our
Alongside.
lender is an in-house SBA provider. They do all their own approvals. They've got a very streamlined process. We use them for Big Bend Biker Hotel. And they're saying that at minimum, it is a 90-day process for any of SBA programs right now, particularly because they have not outlined the specific requisites for those programs. So while we can say that that is a near-term, quick turnaround, yes, in terms of the federal government, yes, 90 days is a quick turnaround. And in terms of immediate cash flow and immediate need, and for those of us who are trying to keep employees on staff, that is not immediate. I cannot do 90 days of payroll and wait and hope that maybe the federal government approves a loan that may or may not truly be forgiven. I mean, that's 6 pay periods for us.
Rick Stevens mentioned in an email earlier today that apparently, and I haven't seen myself, but apparently on the SBA's COVID-19 relief application, that included in the application is whether or not the applicant wants consideration for up to a $10,000 early grant while the application is being processed. I don't know what time frame that is, or if that's true. We're still talking about government time frames, Monica. So I don't know how truly helpful that might be, but it's there in an email I just saw.
Chris, on that, what you're talking about, the $10,000, from what I read, potentially you could have that within a few days to a week. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how far that goes for some of the larger hotels, but just chiming in, that's what I read on the application, was a 3 to 5 day turnaround for that.
And if that's the piece, I read through summaries of the bill just as it was passing, and I believe I did see some wording about early grants not having to be repaid at all, regardless of if you didn't get approved for the loan, you still wouldn't have to pay that.
That's what I read as well. That supposedly the money would that would come through the 10,000, even if you weren't approved, and potentially you wouldn't have to pay it back. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of details, but it did say that.
Eric, in the chat, I'm seeing a request to waive occupancy taxes for the remainder of the year. So we should probably discuss that. One thing to consider is there is a value on that fund to promoting people to start coming back. That as things settle down and loosen, we will, as a community, need funds to promote, to invite people to come back and stay in your property. So that's a balancing act. But Eric, what do you think about our latitude for changing at least the city piece of the hotel tax, and how or whether that would be levied for future business?
Well, council can always take action on waiving the city portion of the hotel occupancy tax in the future. So when you think about that, right, if your rack rate is 120, I mean, you're paying, 6% on that. 6% of the state, 7% of the city. The state, their dollars, you're still going to have to collect for and remit to the state. The city, then you just wouldn't collect that extra 7%. And then certainly, as you indicated, the advertising, the event sponsorships, and the other elements would just, basically stop until we started going back into a collection mode again. So I think that becomes a further discussion, not just with council, but with the hotel and short-term rental community. Is that the direction we want to go?
Then two other comments. Sam asks, why is it up to us to apply for grants and loans if we did not make the decision to close? Why doesn't the city apply for grants or give us loans that we do not have to pay back? So Eric, what's your thought about administering a fund to the hotels for a federal request from the city? Is that something that through FEMA monies could come and be distributed? I don't know how this works, so I'm just passing that question along.
So we are working back with FEMA on assistance for any, costs that the city or the county. A couple years ago, the administration of FEMA changed. Used to have to go through the county to get all the monies into the city. Now cities can go after it directly. So we're working on that from a city perspective. As far as the creation of loans to people, that actually has been contemplated in the past. And in fact, if you look back at one of the hot items from 2012, 2013 were payroll advances to employees, which were considered a loan. The state of Texas municipalities are not allowed to give loans per se or act as a banking institution. So we have
that would need to be a grant. I take it.
Yeah.
Than a loan.
So then you would look at that and determine. There's a lot of determining factors to go in that. Council would have to sit down and have that discussion and look at all the different variables in the different businesses and make a determination on that. My sense is over the next few months we're going to be having those types of discussions. I know that doesn't help with the immediacy, as Sharon had talked about earlier, but those are all things that would look at. And one of the things I'm going to share with everybody is the restrictions on the restaurants and things of that nature, that in the gathering of 10 or fewer people, that came from the governor's office, not from the city or the locale. And we do know that has placed a heavy restriction on travel. We do anticipate the governor is going to continue to probably get more aggressive on restrictions and quarantine of people that are trying to come out from different areas, all in an effort to basically deter people from traveling. So at the state level, that continues to push.
One other thing, sorry, Clay, I was about to pass your question on. Clay mentions it would be better to collect the tax and somehow give it back to the hotels, but I'm afraid that's not actually legal. There's only a certain set of kinds of expenditures that tax can be made. And unfortunately, they all are intended to indirectly benefit the hotels, but I don't think it's legal to just funnel the money back.
Okay.
No, you cannot.
I guess, Eric, this is Clay again, that, just the one thing that I wanted to say again is that, Alpine has decided, as some other, I guess, the counties around here decided to take a different stance. And that is that hotels are not an essential business and we're not able to allow essential travel. And I think that's why a lot of this is coming back to what can the city do for us? Our reservations, just because everything was going on, was already decimated. Almost nobody traveling. But if we were allowed to operate like the rest of the businesses in Texas or much of the country, even a trickle of some guests would allow, it'd be like a bad week during the summer for me, at least. There would at least be something coming in. It's just that this is such an aggressive stance that, it's almost a taking of property that we've been forcibly closed and we can't have any business. I realize if somebody was staying long-term, and there are a few exceptions, but I just think a lot of this would be mitigated if we were able to have some business. And I think that, Vic, I don't know if you had a comment, but you were mentioning something there that I'm not aware of. I don't know if you want to chime in with what New Mexico's doing.
Well, I'll read Vic's written comment. Unless and until everyone shuts down at the same time, this is not going to work. where a few cities and counties are shut down one after another, you might think about having hotels allow 50% occupancy for the next few weeks, like New Mexico did. And Eric, is there any possibility to propose? I mean, especially since the city's requirement falls underneath the counties, if I'm correct. So what the county does is they have jurisdiction over everything that happens in Alpine. So it all comes back to them in a lot of ways. The city can elaborate upon. And so is there a possibility to propose to the commissioners maybe a different set of definitions of essential travel, because it seems like there's a certain kind of movement of people that they're trying to prevent or discourage, and that is people trying to flee and possibly carry the virus from a place with outbreaks to our area and hide away. But if some folks that are coming through and in dire straits, the kinds of things that right now the police department is approving on a case-by-case basis, is there any kind of chance to codify that where the commissioners could make a clear policy that our hotels can follow, and that would enable our businesses they would be open on, at least on this provisional basis, and they would be able to follow the policy themselves? What do you think, Eric?
Well, when I look at the policy relative to law enforcement, military, or critical infrastructure people, and I can only speak to the city, I can't speak to the county right now, but all the folks that have approached us, between myself, Chief Martin, and Lieutenant Fierro, we've gotten back with them very quickly on, basically an understanding and then, an authorization of that on those parties. So I'm not sensing, like, I don't have anybody that's reached out to me and said, hey, I asked and nobody got back with me. And so I think we've been administrating to that as designed, Chris. Relative to the notion on the neighboring state, New Mexico, I think as most people know, I very much follow New Mexico. Obviously my wife and children are there. I have a significant family in New Mexico as well. The state has taken a little different hold. They were very aggressive at first about shutting things down. They also went to a shelter in place as a state already. There was no individual decisions at the city level. It was the governor said, you're doing this. She did also allow for the rule that she used was 50% occupancy in hotels. I think if you look at Albuquerque and Santa Fe, highly government communities, and so there was a lot of government traffic, and I think the decision was made primarily on that. There's also a host of other issues that are going on in New Mexico. Some are similar to far west Texas, some are not. I think the request right now is, will you talk to the Commissioner's Court about contemplating a 50% occupancy rule, which absolutely, I'll have that discussion on Thursday when we reconvene and try to understand what all of their sentiment is and ideas around the 50% idea. I do know, as we've talked about, the people coming in, right? That's where the fear comes from. Is it people from a hotspot in Houston or Dallas or Midland or El Paso, and then does that introduce the virus to the community? And so then what's the risk on that introduction of the virus? So,
and I think part of that is that if the city does want to take that stance, obviously you guys can legally do that, but you're making that decision, and therefore, if you're doing that, separate from the rest of Texas, then you guys should bear a lot more of the burden on this. it's a decision you guys are making because you're fearful of a lot of the unknowns. And like I say, it's, time will tell, but if you were making that decision for all of us, outside of what the state of Texas is governing, then I think that's why you're seeing the pushback on what is the city going to do? Not just say, it's a federal problem. They're going to give you guys some money. There's some programs. It's like, well, you guys made this decision, so you guys need to compensate the hotels, because you are hard shutting the vast majority of us completely down, and for an indeterminate amount of time.
Okay. What other questions do we have?
No, this is Monica again. Listen, going back to Clay's point, that the question is, and I don't know that any of us really feel that it's been addressed succinctly, is if the city has shut us down and the governor's office has not, what is the city doing specifically to mitigate our losses? But aside from flipping us to the feds.
So the city with shutting the hotels in the county, basically creating the same order at the same time, looked at it from a short-term perspective and said, if we can mitigate the issues coming in longer term, do we have a less prolonged issue, right? So if you have a prolonged issue, then that creates more financial havoc in the community. And so the decision was based on that relative to, did the city or the county sit down and say, we're going to map out X amount of dollars to every business? No, the city did not go through and map out a dollar type plan. We have worked through the utilities, if there's any issues with the utilities that the city has oversight on. We're working with those business owners and residents that are impacted. And then the hotel occupancy tax. As far as your overall revenues, is the city guaranteeing revenues for people, Monica? No, the city has not made a determination to guarantee revenues for people. We will certainly at every council meeting continue to look at what are the financial impacts to the businesses, and then what can we do from a redirection on a city perspective to help those businesses. But there's not a dollar for dollar type number that has been put out there or approved.
No, I don't think any of us are looking for a dollar to dollar type number. I think what we're asking is, if the city has taken an extraordinary measure aside from the state, what burden does that then place on the city to help mitigate the impact of your decisions?
Because
And
realistically, the city shouldn't do this without a plan, or, again, you're taking a step, again, different from the rest of Texas, because the state of Texas considers hotels, motels essential businesses, and they define clearly what essential travel is. And I think if it's too easy for the city just to shut us down anytime they become fearful, that's my whole point about moving forward. Then if we're the easiest thing to shut down immediately, that if this flares back up in the fall, it's like, well, let's close them down September, October. Let's be safe. Why take a risk? And
Yeah,
so
but we've not stopped any essential travel.
Actually, you have stopped essential travel as defined by the state of Texas. And, I sent you that information from Austin. There's a lot of cases of essential travel, people caring for the elderly or minors, people trying to get back to their residents. I gave you the specific example of my wife and her mother-in-law traveling back after they lost, her father to colon cancer. Instead of sleeping on the side of the road in their car, they slept in a hotel in Texarkana. And I know
Right.
your point is that you feel like nobody passes through here unless they're going to Big Ben. But I mean, I've sent you a case just last week of a medical professional that said he was credentialed traveling through. And yeah, we didn't get all the details because I think once the police called him, he didn't want to talk to the police. But I think there are instances of essential travel, and we are not allowing essential travel as is defined by the state of Texas and even the ordinance put out here in Austin.
Yeah, we'll just agree to disagree on that, Clay, because every case that has come to us on essential travel, we have authorized. Now, individuals, some of them call us under false pretense, and we're gonna ask the question specifically to essential travel and what specifically they're needing to do. And those we've had people put up in some of the hotels because of, we had a lady whose car broke down. She had nowhere else to go. And so she was put up in a hotel. We've had a couple other instances where people have identified based on critical infrastructure or essential travel, and we've worked on making arrangements. So every one of those situations has come to the chief and Philip and myself, and we've dealt with those.
Eric, one other line of questioning that's come up in the chat from Roger and then from Sam is about, given that the closures are intended to reduce the spread of this disease, Roger specifically asked about the National Guard and Amtrak staff, and wondering, is there anything in place, or can there be anything in place to monitor, ensure self-quarantine? That if these folks who have been allowed a pass to stay in the hotels and to come and go, is there anything that can be done to firmly encourage or require a self-quarantine for those folks coming into town? And then Sam asks about the stores, because he says the shutdown of hotels has not slowed down the flow of traffic of travelers going into our stores, with the possibility of bringing the virus to our town. Should there be an order in place to allow locals only to shop in our stores? So those two questions from Roger and Sam.
So one of the questions on shelter in place that we talked about is, do you go down to a staff plus 10 only in your grocery stores? That is certainly something that could happen. It would limit traffic flow primarily through the two Porter stores. Those would be the two most heavily impacted. That certainly, I talked to Trey Dutch over yesterday about potentially even limiting down to 25 people. You've got a pretty big footprint. So, you've got about 25 lanes. So if you have 25 customers in there, that's about one per lane. But certainly that could be pushed down to 10. Then could you say, hey, only, the judge could issue an order that says, hey, only local people can shop in the stores. And the judge could push that as well. And you'd have to tender an ID that showed you were local. We would have to work back with the stores on the administration of that too. I don't believe judges have that mindset though.
You'd wind up with similar humanitarian concerns as Clay is raising about the hotels too.
That would come up as well.
Yeah. Kathy Wright asks if there's any timeline to open the parks. And I take it, she says, many of our spring guests were here to visit Big Bend National Park. Post 6 April reservations were canceled because National and State Park are canceled. I take it she's referring to the campgrounds specifically. Mm-hmm. And she asked if there's any timeline to open them. And Kathy, I'm Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that kind of lands in the county's lap as they consider these same questions about hotel occupancy. They're looking at RVs and campgrounds.
Well, the national park would have to be closed at the federal level, not even at the state level. There was discussion on the radio show yesterday about do your local counties and local cities create a letter to go up to the Secretary of Interior asking for closure of Big Bend National Park? That's certainly something that the county judges and the mayors could sign off as a request. It doesn't create an absolute. There's very limited traffic down there now. There are folks coming in from other areas. They are by and large just camping, and but that traffic is very, very limited right now.
So this is Sharon again. What my understanding directly from people who are working in these groups and in these hotels, or the places where, for example, the railroad workers are staying. Those rooms are turning over sometimes twice a day, and they're coming from all over the country. Those people are staying there, and the locals are cleaning those rooms, and then they're going out and buying groceries, and they're working. I mean, they're living their day-to-day lives. I don't understand how, with all the people coming going from the city, allowed to be coming and going, how not, shutting us down, everybody else down, it's still exposing the city to all of these other people that are coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the movement of people of essential travel and essential business does create exposure. And so I think every, not just Alpine, but every community across the U.S. is experiencing that, Sharon.
Right, but we're still shut down. And we as small business, small hotel people, large hotel people, whatever, we're getting a lot of flack for, to stay shut when the exposure is still there. There's nothing that can be done to completely reduce the exposure.
Right.
And going beyond the governor's, what his ruling was, again, it comes back to us being harmed financially to the point where it could hurt us in the long term and hurt the city in the long term when the exposure is still there, and it will always be there. And even once the ban is lifted, people are still going to get sick. This is not going away. And just saying that we're going to shut down the city is not going to keep that from happening. Strains of the coronavirus are the common cold. We're going to see this coming back over and over and over again. And this city will die if we keep being shut down every time something like this happens, because we're not going to completely avoid exposure. Everybody's eventually going to get sick.
Sharon, one thing that, and now my mind is trying to click back, but one thing that crosses my mind is that when we're thinking about our council members and our commissioners, our county commissioners, they're trying to make decisions and balance the actual data, which is very limited that they have. And they're also, as we all know, hearing a lot of voices from a very frightened community who are pushing them to take even more drastic restrictions than they already have. And so I strongly encourage all of you to communicate frequently with your council member and your commissioner of your precinct, and not to give them more of the same that they're getting from the scared people, but trying to give them some of that balance, to encourage them to define what essential travel is, to allow you guys to function in that capacity, but to try and give them that voice, because I guarantee you, they are hearing from their constituents right now, we need to shut down the hotels for the whole year, or whatever. There's a lot of really extreme messages that they're getting, and they have to respond to. These are their constituents. And so, but you are as well. And so
the constituents are going to change their mind when this town dies And
I
these
don't
people are
disagree.
not, these people who are making these decisions aren't thinking for the long term. They're thinking for today because they don't want to hurt, they don't want to get the flack that we're getting constantly.
I don't disagree with you, Sharon. That's why I'm suggesting that we all try and keep communicating with the folks who are making this decision, and they're under a lot of pressure right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point. I mean, there are, just as we host this call today, I could host one with people that want very stringent closures, and we would hear, I would hear voicing that we haven't done enough to this point, and we should have shut things down quicker, and we should have already limited to only 10 people in the stores. I mean, I dare come in a morning and I don't get a litany of feedback on all the places that people saw congregating. And so there is that other side of it too. It's a balance, but this is part of what, the counselors and the commissioners are hearing as well. You're right, Sharon. I mean, this is sickness, and there are going to be other strains of sicknesses that are going to continue to develop. And how do we best make sure we handle something that's of categorization of pandemic in nature very quickly, and so it doesn't impact the economics as severely, with whether it's our hotel visitor tourism business or other pieces. So, that's part of the back end work that we're working on. So, every anticipation with COVID-19 is that there'll be a resurgence of the virus this fall, and then potentially something again in 2021. Let's hope we've got some strong vaccines that take the edge off of it at that point, and it doesn't impact us from a commerce perspective. But we've certainly got to push our medical and R&D community on that too.
And Eric, I'm not trying to beat the dead horse, but again, that was this is Clay again, about the, again, I think that there is a high likelihood this resurges in the fall, and if it comes back, I mean, if the first knee-jerk reaction is close all the hotels again, it's not a sustainable, nobody's gonna be able to operate. We can close down, especially during the busiest months of the year. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why, hopefully, because I saw the original meeting, and it was passed pretty quickly, like, yep, let's close the hotels on that Friday. But if there's no give and take, or there's no immediate pain to the city like there is to us, that's why I think that if the city makes that decision, then there needs to be like, okay, we're going to shut you guys down again, but if you do, then X, Y, Z happens. Okay, if we shut you down for more than 2-3 weeks in the year, then you don't have to pay any property tax. Again, I think if we were allowed to operate like the rest of Texas as an essential business and allow essential travel, a lot of this goes away, because then we have no argument. We have much less argument, I should say, because we're being treated like everybody else. But the city is singling us out and making it very, very difficult. And I'm fearful, I know the town's fearful, but I'm fearful that anytime something else comes back up, you guys are just going to just shut the hotels down again. But it's just,
He's right.
I just don't know how that works financially for anybody running a hotel here.
He's right. And that without the hotels, everybody else will die. This is a tourist town.
No, I don't think that's the issue. You've got some chain hotels that are going to survive well, but you've got some small mom and pop operations that are going to have a much more difficult time because we don't have a corporate safety net in place.
Yeah, and certainly on the financial side, when the city or the county looked at imposing any sort of restrictions, understood there would be financial implications to that. you know, there are certain elements from a city perspective that we've had to retract or back pace on because we don't anticipate the revenues will match up with what those budget allocations were. And so that doesn't help you in the short term. I understand that, but you know, these are elements that certainly, you know, it's thrown out on the table. You know, what's the city contemplating? You know, part of our huge push over the last 6 months has been infrastructure revitalization. You know, how do we get things going to create even a more grander environment for tourists and people who want to come visit? So, you know, some of those things that we had been positioning, we've now put on hold. And so, you know, it does have a reverberation as well across other segments. And we'll continue to analyze and address those each and every day and each and every week.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, but I do consider myself to be your advocate, and in some respects, your representative. Though you should represent yourselves, of course, to the council and the commissioners. But I'll be presenting to the council on their April 7th meeting. And I will certainly be reviewing this call and all the communications that I've gotten in person and email from all of you. And I will do my very best to express to the best of my ability what you're going through to the council, so that they have, and specifically to Clay's point, they have the perspective and they know the consequences of the decisions that they're making, to make sure that this kind of decision is never taken lightly, for what it's worth.
All right. Well, I know we're at 11:15. We'd originally scheduled this for an hour. You know, Chris, if we need to reconvene next week, be glad to do that after the council meeting with this group. We can do that on the 8th or the 9th.
Thanks, Chris and Eric. I do appreciate it. I realize this is a tough time for all you guys as well, and y'all are playing your role, and we're just trying to obviously balance this on our side as well. But thanks for everything you guys are doing.
You bet.
Okay, just for clarification, the city is closed till the 3rd. The county's going to push to the 9th. So provided that the county doesn't extend that, we can start booking again on the 9th, or we can start booking on the 10th.
My understanding is their order is going to be through the 9th. We just have to look at that, Monica, whether it's noon on the 9th or 11:59 on the 9th. The 9th would be a Thursday. Chris, can we just take a look at that?
Because we've all got to block our calendars and unblock our calendars, and we just got to be able to figure out what it is that we can offer.
And Eric, are the commissioners meeting today, this afternoon, again?
They're meeting tomorrow to appoint act as their chief medical officer for the county. I don't think that's a proper term, but
Is that the only thing on the agenda?
that's the only thing on their agenda. City Council has a meeting on Tuesday the 7th.
Okay, so I'll review the county's order and see if we can get clarity on, unless they make a change, what's in place right now. And I'll send an email out to everybody.
Right, because the question now is, you know, so the city runs to the 3rd, the county runs to the 6th. So can we start on the 3rd? Can we start on the 6th? Can we start on the 7th? Is it the 4th? We need some guidance.
Well, and as Eric was saying, apparently the county's order, it applies to us as well. So that would be through the 9th. So I'll try and find out exactly when that order ends, and I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.